Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy. I am the Director of Professional Development here at SAES, and we're so honored to have you on this call today. We're going to be talking about the SAES Vital signs. And this is such a really important topic because all schools should have something that they can kind of be working towards. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. This is being recorded for those people who signed up for this, but were not able to attend live. We do have it recorded. And if you have questions or thoughts, we'd love for you to engage by putting those questions in the chat. And since there's not just kind of a small group of us here, I'm perfectly happy for you just to wave your hand and we'll unmute you as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get started. So before we begin, we have right now the people that are on this call I know are have early childhood programs and elementary school programs. And I would say that even though you have those programs, they're not, the vital signs are for all levels of school. The vital signs are super important. And I know that when I was at St. Albans, I spent a lot of time kind of looking at the vital signs and going, what is it that I need to be doing and thinking about as we grow the school and as we think about the future. So I think that's kind of where we're going to begin, is to talk a little bit about, first of all, where do you find the vital signs? So SAES put together a group of what I would say are kind of, I don't want to say benchmarks because that doesn't feel right. Vital signs feel more like the things that we're striving towards, the very best of the best. And so first of all, let's talk about where you can find them. The vital signs are found on the SAES website. And if you go onto that website and you're a member school, you go into the document library under general documents, and that's where you're going to find them. And if you'll just click on that, you'll find a 2-page PDF that gives you a specific wording about the vital signs. We're going to talk in general, and we're going to talk about a few of them, but that's where you find them. And if you're not a member school, then you would have to contact us at the SAES office to find out how to get a hold of those. So that's where you find them. And let's talk a little bit about what vital signs are. I don't know if any of you have read the book, Good to Great. It's an old book and it's a great business book, but I think super applicable to schools as well. It's by an author named Jim Collins. And what he did in that book is he talked did kind of a research project around what makes a company go from good to great. And for me, that's kind of what the vital signs are, is they tell us what are the very, very best schools doing and how can we get there, right? So in this little diagram, we talk about kind of everyone on the bottom part of this pyramid. We're talking about all the things that most schools are doing. These are the things that we really strive to the very baseline of what a school should be doing. This is licensing. This is compliance with the state. Even if you're not licensed, you're going to have compliance that you have to follow with agencies that are related to school operations. And so that's really the foundation for me of what a school should be trying to accomplish. The next level, if you are an accredited school, is the standards of the Association for SAES. And you can also find the accreditation standards. If you're watching this and you're wondering about accreditation, you can find those also in the document library or under accreditation resources on our website. And so again, if you're a member school, you can find that easily. If you're not a member school, then you'd need to call the SAES office. But the accreditation standards are those standards that as an accredited organization, we expect you to meet in order to retain that accreditation. And then finally, you get to the very top of the pyramid, and that is kind of what we were talking about with the good to great. What are the characteristics that the very most high performing schools share? And again, you know, there's a lot of things that we think about. We have so many schools in the association that it's really sometimes kind of hard to go, well, what do we all need to be doing? But the reality is that this is what these are the vital signs that every school should be doing, whether they're a preschool that's a standalone preschool, whether they've got 20 kids or 200 kids, doesn't matter. These are the things that most high performing schools are trying to accomplish. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about why we named it Vital Signs. Of course, we all kind of think about our health a lot. I'm sure no one likes to talk about their health. We don't really want to do the work that requires it. But the reality is that no matter what age we are, when we are looking at our health, there are certain things that when we go to the doctor, people look at to make sure that we're healthy, because not always, sometimes we're not healthy and we don't even realize it. And so to me, that's what the vital signs are, is that an opportunity for a school to take a look at what does a healthy school look like? Not just a healthy school, but a really healthy school, a thrivingly healthy school. What do they look like? And what are they, what are we not doing? What do we look like compared to them? And then we can kind of get our stuff together. So in the medical sense, if you know your blood sugar is out of control, then you're going to get medicine, right? Well, the same is true for the vital signs. So what are some possible uses? Why do we even need to know that? Well, for me, again, as a head of school, I was always trying to figure out what it is that we need to be doing to be better. That's a huge part of your job as a head of school, or as a board chair, or as, even as on the board level. It's important that we take a look at how do we improve. So one of the ways that you might consider using vital signs is for strategic planning. I like to, whenever I do work with a school on a strategic plan, one of the biggest things that we talk about is the vital signs, and what are we striving for, and where are you as a school in relation to that? So we might look at trends of the industry, trends happening in Episcopal schools and even in independent schools. We might look at the local trends. We might look at the local economy. We might look at a lot of things, but we definitely look at the vital signs, because even if you are not in the middle of a strategic plan, or you haven't even begun a strategic plan, it is a simple process to pull up the vital signs and go, hey, here's what we should be doing. What are we doing relative to this? And could we pick a couple of things that would allow us to just set some strategic initiatives very quickly? So for me, I think that's a great way to begin with the vital signs. The second thing would be annual goal setting for the board and the head. And that might be that you do have a strategic plan and you've got some goals relative to that strategic plan, but you might see something on the vital signs that you think, oh gosh, this is something we should be doing, that doesn't necessarily need to be a strategic initiative, but it needs to be something that we set for ourselves as a board or as the head of school. And so that would be another easy way, I think, to use the vital signs to set some goals for yourself. The last way that you might consider using the vital signs is to take a look at, if you're making a large decision, something like expanding your program, something like a capital campaign, to do some analysis with it prior to making that decision. I think, especially when we get to the vital signs, you're going to see a number of financial benchmarks that we would encourage you to consider. And for example, in a capital campaign, if you're considering a capital campaign, but you look at those benchmarks and you think, oh gosh, we've got some financial benchmarks we need to meet before we can do this capital campaign, that would be a good way to use the vital signs. So I'm going to stop right there and wonder if you guys have any questions real quickly before we move on relative to what I've said. Shoot those in the chat, or just raise your hand and you can ask it. I've got the chat up, so feel free to, as we go along, if you have a question as we go along, just throw it in the chat. All right, so here are the vital signs. And again, you can find these in detail on, and we're going to look at them at the end of the webinar, but this is a basic kind of sketch of what the vital signs include. And they're divided into categories. So as you'll see, we kind of start at the top with marketing and enrollment. So there's going to be questions, vital signs around marketing enrollment, around facilities, around program, Advancement. So advancement includes fundraising. It includes how are we advancing the mission. There's going to be vital signs around governance, financial management, faculty and staff, and church school relationship. And so what I'm going to do today is we're going to talk about a few of these. We don't have the time to talk about all of them. That'd be too much detail. And not all of them they don't all hold the same relevance, in my opinion, about in terms of importance. So I want to kind of hone in on the ones that I think are super, super important. And then we're going to do a deep dive into some of them. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you to consider what it is that you feel like y'all are doing really well in, and maybe some areas that you learned about that you feel like you could improve upon. So we'll come back to this slide in just a little bit. So let's start with the idea of professional staff. And I'm going to tell you, I think you've probably all heard me say this before, but I don't think that there is a more important part of the school than professional staff. I thought about this often when I was a head of school. And the reality is we could have the greatest facilities, the greatest program, the best curriculum. And if we don't have great teachers, it doesn't matter. It's kind of like a doctor. If you don't have great people with skills and the ability to work with people, if you don't have that in medicine, it doesn't matter. And I just really believe that professional staff is probably, to me, the most important vital sign and the easiest way that we can begin this conversation around that. So there are 4 vital signs that I want to talk about that have to do with professional staff. Obviously, the first one is faculty and salaries. And the vital sign itself, and we're going to do a deep dive into this, is that your faculty salaries are 85 to 90% of the local ISD. And the bottom line is that feels simple, but the reality is that we all live in different communities. Some communities have a lot of different kinds of schools. They have charter schools, and they have homeschool, and they have public schools, and they have maybe several different public school systems. I live in a smaller community. We have one public school system in our town, but we do have charter schools, and we do have a couple of magnet schools. And so what we did is we looked at the local public school. Now we're going to deep dive into that in just a minute, but the benchmark here is that you are paying your salaries within 85 to 90% of the local ISD. The second one is professional development. And I will tell you, I will come clean and say that the very first thing I did often when we were struggling financially is to say, oh, let's cut PD and let's figure out a cheaper way to do it. And the reality is that professional development is very, very important. And yes, you can find ways to do it in a more frugal way, but it really needs to be a significant investment of the annual budget. The benchmark there is 1 to 2% of your annual budget. And that's a pretty big number. And what I would encourage you to think about is just working towards increasing that as you can. But for sure, not saying, hey, I'm not going to do professional development this year, or we're not going to offer that to our faculty. Because if you're going to have great faculty, you got to train them. You got to give them what they need. And hopefully it's not just, hey, we're only going to spend our PD dollars on curriculum that we just purchased, curriculum training. Hopefully it's bigger. Hopefully you're having professional staff that comes to you and says, hey, I want to learn more about this. I want to do that. The very best schools take professional development, and they may put aside a little bit of money for what they know they need in terms of curriculum or how they want their staff to grow as a whole, but that there's got to be some money set aside for when a teacher or a staff member has expressed a goal or an interest in something, and that you're able to put money into that as well. So I like that, because teachers have a little skin in the game in their growth. And so definitely a significant investment of the annual budget is dedicated to professional learning. Number 6 of professional stuff of the vital signs is instructional practices. And this is really kind of focused around the idea of making sure that your school is really, and it's kind of tied to number 2, the idea of that you are at the very top of your game in best educational practices, that you are offering differentiated instruction, that you're giving your staff what they need to learn how to do differentiated instruction, that you're staying above the baseline in terms of the very top, most recent educational practices. Okay, Cynthia, you had a question. When you say annual budget, do you mean tuition revenue? Yeah, because we're assuming that the tuition and the expenses equal out to a 0 budget. So yeah, I think what I would probably say is that 1 to 2% of your tuition revenue would be good. I mean, I don't think it has to be perfect. It's just kind of a baseline, but yeah, that's a good question. I always assume, which it's a big assumption, that we're on a 0-based budget, that your revenue and your expenses are equal. And so when we say budget, that's what I mean. Okay, so back to instructional practices, that we're spending time making sure that our faculty is at the top of their game, and that they're learning everything that they need to learn. That we would never want to go to a doctor that hasn't had any, continuing ed on the newest and latest surgical procedures. We don't want that, right? Well, we don't want that in our schools either. And so for me, this is a really important one, and it's one that kind of sometimes gets left behind. Finally, number 7 is administrative staff. And this benchmark, or this vital sign, is really around the idea that you have enough administrative staff to run your school, that you're not trying to run a school of 325 kids with 3 people. And I say that because I did that, and it was not easy. And so that your school is adequately able to address the daily operational needs of the school with the admin that you need. The other part of that, and I think this gets left out a lot, is that succession plans are in place to keep institutional knowledge in place. You guys, we all know, I think Rob said this at the last meeting, but we have had a lot of turnover in school heads this year. And a lot of that turnover was in a difficult environment. It wasn't hey, I'm leaving in a year and because I want to retire and everything's great. It was more, hey, I'm gone. And so that makes a succession plan even more important, not just for your head of school, but for your business manager, for your advancement officers, for anybody who it would be a real problem if they walked out the door and you didn't know where their stuff was. So that's I think something that's important. So let's deep dive a little bit into the faculty salaries, because it's a question that we often ask. And I would love for you to put in the chat where you stand on this. Faculty and salaries are at least 85 to 90% of the local ISD, and basic benefits, health and retirement are offered to enhance the likelihood of recruiting the quality faculty and staff that parents expect. Or there's a solid plan in place to deal with this vital issue. You guys, we know that you're not going to be able to do this overnight. When we did this years ago, we did do it in 1 year, but we did not add health and retirement in 1 year. We added retirement as a pension because it's a requirement now by the Episcopal Church USA, but that was added a few years later, and it was added all at once to get everybody to 5%. And then we added another % each year. So what I'm saying to you is that this benchmark is a big one, and it's a difficult one to have to get done in 1 year because it's very expensive. But what I like about this part is that there's a solid plan in place to deal with it. And so it may just be that you guys begin with, how are we going to get our teachers there? How are we going to add in health if we can, make sure that the retirement is where it's supposed to be. And because the fact is that this is how we keep people really good teachers, and how we compete to get the very best teachers in our community. So Heather says we're below the benchmark. We're at about 70. and working to raise salaries. Yes, it does take a few years, Heather. And one thing that I would also say about this is that it's a challenge, because once you get them there, then the public school decides to give a big fat raise again. And then you're back down to, you were at 85 or 90, and now you're back down to 80, so it's a hard place, not just to get, but to stay. And so I do know that. And we talk about this a lot. I think the other thing you have to pay attention to is what we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you have public schools and then you have charter schools, and they pay very differently. A lot of times the charter schools pay more money. And so are we competing with them, or are we competing with the public school? Well, that's going to depend on your community. And in our community, we have a variety of districts and a variety of charter schools. So that requires a little bit higher threshold in which we have to compete, because we can't just say, well, it's one, because the other ones are bigger. So we have to pay attention to that. Yeah, Andy, it's very common for us to be low on this benchmark. And so I encourage you not to be discouraged, but I encourage you to make this a priority. All right, let's switch gears here and let's go to the vital signs for governance. But before we do, let's see, we give our staff of faculty a monthly stipend for insurance. Yeah, and do not have retirement. Over the years, the retirement program was neglected. Yeah. Yeah, it's all a slow process, Heather. So it is. And I encourage people to remember that and not get too discouraged about it. All right, we're going to switch gears now. So we've talked a little bit about the vital signs for professional staff. Now we're going to talk about the vital signs for governance. And I'm going to focus on 3 of them. There are more, but these are the 3 that I think we should focus on. And the first one is the board. And the vital sign here is that the board has a clear understanding of what's expected of it. And it avoids becoming overly involved in operational issues. And so that's something we preach all the time in leadership and governance. It's something that we preach all the time when we do any kind of board training, understanding the role and responsibility of the board and keeping the main thing when it comes to a board member. I think that's an easy one. If you're all onboarding new people, that you're creating a board culture that understands that, it's easy. If you're not doing that, it can be a challenge. The next one is evaluation. And this is the one we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on, but that is the evaluation not only of the head of school, but the board of trustees. And if you're an accredited school, you know that this is also an accreditation standard, that each year that there is an evaluation of the head of school by the board, and that evaluation is based on goals that were set together and encouraged. Maybe it's from the strategic plan, maybe some additional ones. We're going to talk about that. And then that we're also evaluating the board of trustees, that the board evaluates itself and takes a look at how are we doing with regard to meeting our strategic initiatives, with regard to attendance, with regard to engagement. It's not just the head of school. We should be looking at both of those things. The final governance vital sign that I would like to talk about is strategic planning and thinking. We're finding, I don't know how you guys are seeing it, if y'all are in the midst of a strategic plan. In fact, I'd love for you to put that in the chat. If you're starting one, if you're in it, if you've got to start one. But a lot of people put off strategic planning during COVID because that was clearly no one knew what they were doing. We weren't able to strategically think. We were down in the weeds. But now that that's really kind of, knock on wood, behind us, people are beginning to do that again. And it's a really critical thing for the board, and as a governance vital sign, it's absolutely one of the top things that the board is required to do. They should be doing it on an ongoing basis. And not only should they be writing a strategic plan, there should be a strategic financial plan that goes with that. Well, now what do I mean by that? Well, there's arguments that the strategic plan ought to be anywhere between 1 and 3 years. Anything over 3 years is going to be kind of difficult because we all know how rapidly things change. Anything under a year really is not, there's not enough time to really determine what should our initiatives be and how are we going to build a financial plan around that. So I recommend every 3 years. And then once that's done, it's really critical that we ask ourselves the questions, okay, here are our initiatives. How are we going to pay for it? Because it doesn't really matter if we put together the list, the greatest list of all time about what we want to accomplish. If it's going to cost money to do it and we don't have the money to do it, then we haven't made any progress. And so that's one of the reasons I think that the Accreditation Standards Committee requires that to go along with the strategic plan. The board, their job is to be strategically thinking all the time. And so doing that and then taking that plan and going back to number 10, the vital sign for number 10, evaluating ourselves based on what the strategic initiatives are for this year, really critical way to make sure that we're staying on plan. So Cynthia says, we're just developed a new one and beginning to work on it. Excellent. We're beginning the process. I love it. Gathering the team, hopefully meeting next week. I love it. That's excellent. That's good news. So let's do a little deep dive into evaluation. And you guys know how, if you know me at all, you know that I talk about head support and evaluation all the time, because it's something that people don't, they know it's important, but they don't really want to do it. And there's a reason people don't want to do it, because the reality is that evaluation is hard. Feedback is hard. We talked a little bit about that at the symposium, the leadership symposium this last week, about asking the question, asking for feedback and being willing to receive it. And I think it's important, again, not just for the head of school to do that, but for the board to do that. But what we're going to focus in on right now is the head support and evaluation. And what we recommend is that the board establish a subcommittee called the Head Support and Evaluation Committee. And that committee's job is to execute the evaluation process on the behalf of the board. And it's also its job to support and nurture the head of school throughout the year. So why would you have a separate committee as opposed to having the whole board do it? Because it's a pretty complex job to do, and to try to get too many people doing it is difficult. Who should be on it? We recommend that the evaluation committee be board members who can be fair and balanced in their work, guard against special interests, respect confidentiality, and honor the appropriate boundaries of authority between the board and the head. Now, having said that, it could be that you have somebody on your head support and evaluation committee that's not a board member if they're a trusted member of your community. I did have that on my head support and evaluation committee periodically. I had somebody that was on there that was a trusted member of the community. Maybe they had, this particular person I'm thinking of had been on the board before. They had kids at the school. They were a member of the church, and it was just somebody I really trusted. The head should have some input in who is on that committee. We've talked a little bit about in the past, should it be a separate committee? Should it be the executive committee? In my situation, it was the executive committee. That's a great question, Peggy. In my situation, it was, and it worked out fine. The challenge with it being in the executive committee automatically is that it could be that there are people on the executive committee that are really good at their job on that committee, but they're not necessarily going to be good at this job. And so I think the idea, David Madison used to say this, the idea of it being automatically the executive committee, I don't think is a good idea. If it works for you, great. It worked for me most of the time. But I think sometimes it would be good to think it maybe bigger picture and go, hey, who really needs to be on this committee and who doesn't? So what are some steps to creating this head support and evaluation committee? Well, the first thing that the head support and evaluation committee needs to do is it needs to be a small group of people, again, primarily board members, very trusted, very confidential, and not a big group. I usually had no more than 5 people on that committee, and usually 3 to 4. I think 5 people is good because sometimes you need more than just 1 or 2 people to get feedback on. So, and we're going to talk about why that is important. So get a committee of 4 to 5 people, very trusted, very confidential. And then that committee sits down and begins to think about what are the essential expectations we expect out of the head of school. You should always have a list of essential expectations. These are things like, am I on time to work? Do I present myself professionally? Do I show up for events? Do I, things that are just baseline, kind of like in our little beginning process when we talked about the vital signs, kind of just that baseline of the pyramid. What's the basic thing that I should be doing? The next step would be that the head of school would create 2 or 3 major objectives that they would like to accomplish in their year and present those to the committee. And then the committee may also be working on some of those objectives. It kind of depends on where you are in your career. If you're a brand new head of school and you're coming in, that committee may have some very specific things that when you were hired, they wanted you to accomplish. So those could be part of the objectives. You may have some ideas about things that you feel like you need to work on, and those should be part of the consideration. And then there should be a summer meeting where all of these items are reviewed, and we come up with 2 to 3 goals that we're gonna work towards. Okay. The adoption of those goals really should be presented to the board kind of at the beginning of the year. Now I realize it's September. Is it too late? Of course not. It's not too late. I would encourage you to do it if you haven't done it. I would encourage you to work towards this. Don't feel like you have to wait, because you want to try to get an evaluation by the end of the year, and you want it to be based on goals that you set. And then this piece is really important to me, and it's the part about meeting periodically. We don't want the head support and evaluation committee to work on goals and say, okay, Mary Catherine, here are your goals, and then never talk to me again. This is the nurturing part that I think is super important. And in the vital signs, when we talk about evaluation and support of the head of school, that is something that the very best schools are doing, is that their head of school is not only being evaluated based on your goals and objectives that you agree upon, but they're being supported, especially in this day and age when we all know it's very difficult to be a head of school. How often should you meet? Well, if you're a brand new head of school, I would say every month. If you're not a brand new head of school and people feel like you know what you're doing and you feel like you know what you're doing and you don't need to meet every month, maybe quarterly. What do we do at those meetings? And I didn't put this on the slide, but what I would like to see you do at these meetings is that you bring ideas and thoughts. This should be your think tank. In my opinion, that's why it's so important that the confidentiality is honored, because if this is a think tank in which you can go to this group and say, hey, I'm considering this, or I'm thinking about that, sometimes there's risk in offering ideas, and you want to be able to do that for your full board, but sometimes something's even so risky that you really need to talk about it from a confidential perspective with your head support and evaluation committee. This is also a committee that you can go to and say, I'm in trouble. I need help. I'm really struggling. I'm really discouraged. This is a committee that should be really focused on nurturing and supporting the head of school. Not just, are you meeting your goals of enrollment, or are you meeting but how are you doing? And I would encourage any board member that's on this committee to be asking that question. How are we doing? Questions about that before we begin? Any questions about the head support and evaluation committee? I'd love to answer those. Reach out. Let's see, what is the difference between where the number 2, where the head of school drafts 2 or 3 major objectives, and number 4, adoption of the goal at the first meeting? Well, Peggy, the thing about it is that you don't get to set your own goals only, but the board shouldn't only set the goals. So for me, it should be a combined effort. You bring to the table the things that you feel like that you need to improve upon, things that you need support with, goals that you have going forward. And then the board may have the same thing. Let me give you an example, a personal example. So I was particularly struggled, I think, with managing my time when it came to being in the classroom, because I felt like I had so many other things. And the truth is that curriculum and instruction was not my, that was not my best skill. I didn't have a lot of learning in that area. And so it was hard for me to go into classrooms and to know if a teacher, I mean, I could tell you if a teacher needed to improve on something, but it was sometimes hard for me. That was just not my gift. Money, finances, development, board work, those were my gifts. So what do we tend to do? We tend to spend time on the things that we're good at, and we tend not to spend time on things that we're not, right? And so often I would go to the board and say, hey, I've got a goal of, I'm going to spend X amount of hours per week in the classroom, just encouraging and watching and listening, right? So I brought that to the table. But there was one time where one of my board chairs brought to the table, they wanted me to be out into the community more, and like for carpool. I put myself in carpool at the same place every morning to try to be kind of, but what was happening is no one else ever saw me at the other 3 spots that we dropped off, right? So that was a goal that they had for me, was they wanted me not to do carpool. They wanted me to be circling and I think spending more time in the community where parents saw me. And so they brought that goal to the table, and I brought the other goal to the table. And we decided on those 2 goals as 2 of the things that I would be working on. So does that answer your question, Peggy? Does that make sense? Good. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the financial vital signs. And these are really, I think, cut and dry. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I was reading over the vital signs. There are 13 vital signs, but number 13 is financial. And under number 13, you're going to find 12 additional financial vital signs that you should pay attention to. We're going to look at 5 of those today, and we're going to deep dive on 2 of them. So the first one's pretty simple. It's the 120-day rule. It's just making sure that you are analyzing your cash reserves, that you're working towards having 120 days of cash in the bank ready to go if something happens. The second one, monthly updates to the board. Are you updating your board monthly on financials? How are they reported? Do you have a dashboard? We're going to take a look at that because that's something that I think is important as well. The third one, an audit or review. Do we have audits and reviews going on? And that would be an independent audit. Now, the accreditation standard is that if you're accredited and you have a revenue of $1 million or more, that you have to be audited every year by an independent auditor. If you have less than that, less than $1 million in revenue, that you would have a review every other year and an audit every other year. So you can go back and forth, but it still needs to be independent. It can't be an internal audit. Number 13E, head of school oversight, that the head of school has access to all information, regularly discusses matters with business office and treasurer. You guys, this is one of my, something I really get irritated about. The head of school is the CEO of the company, and the CEO of the company may not write the checks, but they should know what's going on financially. And I realize that that can be a challenge for us in independent schools, because many of us, unlike me, most heads of schools are educators. They came up through the ranks of being teachers, and then they were admin, and maybe they weren't necessarily well-versed on accounting, and that's okay. The truth is I have a lot of accounting and I'm not that great at it, but my degree is in business. And so this was something that came easy to me. However, it's also something that's really important. And so I don't think it can be something that you just go, well, I'll just let my treasurer deal with that, or I'll just let the business office deal with that. You have to have oversight over that. The last one is the 80 to 95% of hard income. And here's what this means. The vital sign is that schools are operating their budget on 80 to 95% of hard income, which equals tuition and fees. Okay. That's not, our tuition covers about 70 to 60%, 60 to 70% of our cost, and we fundraise the rest. Now, ISM, Independent School Management, often will say that your school should be operating on 100% of hard income. And what that means, back to kind of what we talked about earlier about the budget, what that means is that 100% of your hard expenses are covered by tuition and fees. Now, I don't think that that's a real easy thing to do. I don't know a lot of schools who are able to achieve that kind of benchmark, but that's what ISM thinks. SAES really is a proponent of more like 80 to 95% of hard income, which means that you're fundraising about, anywhere between 5 and 20% of your budget. And that's still a lot. 20% of your budget is a lot to fundraise. So, and trust me, because I raised the money, I remember, and we weren't at this level in the beginning, and it's hard. So I want to deep dive on a couple. Number one is the monthly updates to the board. If you go back to the webinar that we did with best practices of high performing boards, Rob Devlin spent some time talking about this dashboard that you see right here. And so I'm not going to go over it again. I would encourage you to go back and look at that webinar because he spent some time on it. But what this just does is it's a way for you to tell the status of your finances to your board and let them see it in a way that makes a lot of sense. It's a pretty simple form. It looks a little complicated here, but it's not. It talks a lot about, like up here, you see at the very top, what you see is information on what your current monthly expenses are related to the budget. Down here, maybe some information around projections. It's got enrollment projections. It's got all kinds of things on here that are things that you should pay attention to and that your board should be paying attention to. What I want you to understand from the vital signs perspective is that high performing boards are every single month keeping their board, they're learning this information. They're using data to make decisions. They're using the data from their dashboard. They're using the data from budgets. They're using the data from long-range financial plans to make decisions. They're not making decisions based on just how they feel. And so the more data you can give to your board, the better. And it should be monthly. So it shouldn't be, every single month you should have a finance committee meeting, and the finance committee should understand where you are financially. And then the finance chair or the business officer or whoever is doing that should be offering that to the board so that they understand as well. Peggy, you asked the question, a hard copy of the document. You can, I think, access that through the the high performing boards webinar. If you can't access it, just shoot me an email. Okay. And I can send it to you. So back to this idea of the budget is no less than 85 to 90% hard income. I just want to make sure, I don't know how much you guys, I'd be interested to know what y'all are doing in terms of fundraising. Is this a benchmark? Throw in the chat if this is a benchmark that you're seeing that's difficult. I know that there were times where we were fundraising 25 to 30% of our budget. And we did that through annual fund. We did that through the gala. We usually did some fall things and then some spring things, and it's a lot. And so I'm just curious if you guys are fundraising. Do y'all even have an annual fund? Let's see. Yep. Very difficult. Are you fundraising via annual fund? Put that in the chat if you have an annual fund. Yeah. Yeah, so that's why this benchmark is where it is. That's why we do this vital sign, because we don't want you to have to fundraise that much money. It's a lot of pressure on, if you have a development office, it's a lot of pressure on the head of school if you don't. So we're fundraising through annual fund as well as other fundraisers throughout the year. Yeah. So this benchmark is super important. It's something that we miss often because we don't even think about checking to see how much of our budget are we actually fundraising. And it would be a really good question for any board member or finance committee member or head of school to ask, how much are we actually fundraising? How much does our hard tuition, our fees, how much is that covering? So what I'd like to do now in our final few minutes is to have you look back at this. And I'm just curious, I'm going to go ahead and have you unmute if you would. And I'm curious about a few things. Is there a particular vital sign that jumps out at you as one in which your school is excelling? Is there anything in any of those areas? Let me go back to this. Not just the ones we really did a deep dive on, but church-school relationship, financial management, governance, advancement, program, facilities, marketing. Is there anything that you really feel like you're doing well at? Where do you believe your school needs to improve? And what was a surprise to you? So I'd love to just kind of get your last final thoughts or any questions you might have.
Mary Catherine, this is Cynthia. I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm not
Cynthia.
Hi. I would say one of the things that we really, of these things that jumps out at me is this church school relationship. We really, I know it hasn't always been as strong as it is now, but it is very strong. And we just had a change in our head of school, and it still appears to be very strong. And so that's something we're very much focused on nurturing and making sure stays stable. I think of these things that we need to work on, I would say facilities is probably the thing that jumps out at me, that's our strategic plan. So
okay. And so facilities in terms of, so let's look at that for just a second. So let me pull up, I'm going to pull over here if I can do it. Can y'all see the vital sign that I just put up? Or
no,
what do y'all see?
We still see the question mark.
Oh, you do? Okay. All right. Let me see if I can.
You may have to reshare.
Let me see. Reshare. I'd like to show you this. Let me reshare it. Yeah, I want y'all to see the vital signs so that you can. Okay, can y'all see it now? The document now? So what you're going to see here is when you pull up the vital signs, this is what you're going to see. It's a 2-page document. And so let's go down to facilities and maintenance. Facility and grounds maintenance needs are addressed promptly, and every effort is made to create attractive, beautifully maintained, clean, and safe environment. So Cynthia, what is your kind of like, what are you thinking around that in general?
So, we're very fortunate. We do have a very nice campus. I think when I look at this, I think more like capacity.
I see
having the right facility for the number of students that we have. I mean, we're okay, but I think we're lagging a little. So it's not a safety issue. When you go on campus, it is beautiful. They've done an amazing job creating a beautiful kind of sanctuary environment. It is clean, and it's just more. There are facilities that are dated not only in the way they look, but they were designed for a different time, and so they need to be updated. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, of course. And I think that's a constant challenge, to be truthful. We're always just when you get it done, you have to start over. I mean, it's just like your house. You think, well, I'm going to remodel it. I've remodeled my house 4 times, and I'm already thinking about every 4 to 5 years. I'm like, that looks old. That needs to be fixed. That needs to be painted. So yeah, Cynthia, I can totally, I can relate to that. And I think all schools do, for sure. So what else jumps out at you guys as what you think you're doing well at, what you'd really maybe surprised you, or you'd like to work on? Just unmute and say so.
My biggest concern, I mean, obviously our enrollment is down, but our instructional practices are not where they need to be at all.
Okay.
And there's a lot of denial around that. So
yeah, sure.
It's a big task to shift the understanding of what best practices are and the
Yeah.
reason for it and the reason for differentiated instruction. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
right
like
now
that,
my
Andy.
biggest concern.
Yeah, I like that. And look at this. This is the vital sign.
Mhm.
Academic leaders recognize the necessity of addressing the vastly diverse aptitudes, abilities, and learning styles of current students.
Mhm.
And
There's
I
a
think it's really critical that if sometimes we have to shift that mentality.
Mhm. There's a belief that all of these students are significantly advanced and they just aren't.
Yeah, yeah, and
And they're
especially with COVID, you guys,
yeah.
we're really going to run into that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so that we can wrap this up. And then I'm happy to sit, since we're recording, I'm happy to sit and visit with you guys for just a few more minutes. But what I want to say just in conclusion is this. Vital signs are not, for me, they're not something that you just go, oh, here it is, check off the box, I never have to deal with it again. It's an ongoing journey to try to meet those things. And it's really for lack of a better word, I'm thinking about the Proverbs 31 woman, where people always say, oh, that's a perfect person. Well, I don't think that scripture was ever intended to describe one person. And I don't think the vital signs are intended. I don't think there's a school that exists that every single vital sign they can just check off the list and they're perfect. We all have stuff we have to work on, but the vital signs for me creates a great checklist of things that I can strive towards. And so that's what I hope that everyone has gotten out of this. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. If you are watching this on recording, thank you. We're glad you came. Those of you who came live, we're super glad that you came and were a part of it. And we hope you have a great day.